All right, welcome to the podcast again. This is episode 5 of the PM Hive Podcast. Today we have another special guest, Gabe. You are an entrepreneur, ex-entrepreneur, two-time entrepreneur. You are also a game programmer, and you probably have other experiences that we probably want to dive into today. So today's going to be obviously a special episode. I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions related to your entrepreneurship experience, your game development experience, maybe a few questions about how people can align passions with what they do in a more stable environment in the work capacity that they today's digital age, especially, right? So kind of wanted to dive into these questions today and get started. So before that, I just wanted to give you maybe a minute or two to introduce yourself, your background, and where you're at right now.
Yeah, so my name's Gabe Karkanis. We'll go deep into the background pretty soon, but I'm an entrepreneur, as you say. I started in tech, and it's been a very interesting 15 or so years that I've been in industry now. That's just a quick intro on myself, and I guess we can move on.
Perfect. So again, because of your entrepreneurship experience, I know there's going to be a lot of stuff that we can touch into, both breadth and depth. So that's great. Great content for our listeners today. And the first question right off the bat really is just, so what got you into entrepreneurship? What was kind of like that kick in the butt, so to speak, to really make you realize that you wanted to pursue this? Because I think in today's day and age, right, like obviously entrepreneurship is a lot less gate kept, very easy to kind of go in, pitch your ideas to a lot of VCs and accelerators. There's a lot of venture capitalists as well as angel investments circling around a lot of the major tech hubs that we see in North America. Obviously in Vancouver, there's kind of like a still growing market, right? But just what your experience has been, and what really pushed you to make it into the big league.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of what got me into entrepreneurship in the first place, I always call it startups, but entrepreneurship is really the same thing. And I think what really got my interest in it was, I'm just thinking back to when, I think it was 2013, 14, 2012, around there. Even before that, actually, just going back to when I was actually doing sales for a couple years. And this is actually not on my LinkedIn. It's not really relevant to what I'm doing with my next step, so I just took it off. But it is a big chunk of my life. It was 3 years in sales that I was doing. And so I was basically hitting the phones, cold calling customers 8 hours a day, super stressful, just cold outreach and building relationships. And just kind of going even a few steps back, I'm just sort of like an onion in my mind that's just, the layers are starting to become clear to me. It all really started when I was actually in university and I was taking computer science. And I ended up reading a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. And the whole gist of the book was all about, there's two types of people in this world. There's people that work and there's people that work on businesses. So, you're either working in the business or you're working on businesses. That really stuck with me. I have huge respect for working in the business. That's what I've done my whole career. I also enjoy building businesses as well. So I'm not saying one's, better than the other. But just seeing this type of possibility really opened my eyes. And then I began to shift my career a little bit, going from software engineering, from basically being a builder, and then I actually went to business school and did a couple years of commerce. That was my attempt of building some skills for startups and entrepreneurship. And that was where I kind of got the initial bug. But then I graduated. It was 2009, the recession. I couldn't get any jobs. It was just really slim pickings. So I ended up taking a job doing sales. And this is kind of how I got into that sales job I was talking about. So I did this job for a couple years. And part of why I took that job was, in that book that I read, a big part of the advice that Robert Kiyosaki was giving was, if you want to become a successful business owner, the number one thing you have to master is sales. And so I really took that to heart. And that was why I went into that sales job, like guns a-blazing, ready to just work hard, just wanted to master the trade. I ended up hiring like a $15,000 sales coach. And this is like 2009. So this is like, way more money than what it's worth today. And so I kind of took a couple years, but I basically mastered that sales. And then I'd say this is kind of the most interesting part of what I'm going to be getting at with this question, which is, we were hosting a client event for prospects. We rented this beautiful building downtown Victoria, brought all these high net worth people in, and we were basically this really high profile event. We wanted to build these relationships and close some of these high quality leads. Very posh event, like 4-course meal. People came in to give talks. They brought in Brian Scudmore, I think it was, from the 1-800-GOT-JUNK and some other really successful founders. And they started giving talks about, how to build a successful business, how it all comes down to the people at the end of the day, et cetera. So started feeling this kind of urge being pulled out of me, like, hey, I'm identifying with what these people are saying, but I'm a sales guy and I'm just doing a sales job for commission. So I suddenly feel like a fish out of water. And that's really what kind of set me up on the tee, and what really was kind of the home run for me was later that night. We all had to go find a table, and there was about 3 or 4 guys at a table, and they just said, oh, hey, why don't you come sit with us? Just, everyday guys dressed in everyday clothes, and here's me in my suit trying to do sales. So I sat down at this event with these 3 other guys, and they were like, hi, very friendly, very down to earth. And they asked me what I do. I told them, and then I was like, well, what do you guys do? So they each started going through what they do for their work, and they're each entrepreneurs. And so one of them was like, yeah, we created a Facebook game. It's taken off. We've grown to like 9 people. I just sold it for $2 million, and now I'm on to my next venture. And the guy beside him just went off, yeah, I founded this company, and we're growing at this rate. We're at 30 people. And it just really struck me how they were everyday people sitting next to us. And they really had figured it out. They were on a whole different playing field. And so that's what really caught my attention and made me want to just jump into startups. I remember I left that event, and sometimes when I process things, I do voice notes. So I was doing this, voice note on my phone, just going off, and my head was just, my head has exploded. And it's like, these people are so incredible. What they're doing is so inspiring. And like that night, I knew that I needed to make a change because I wasn't doing what I felt this calling for, this new calling. I just felt it. Mm-hmm. And the very next day, I think it was actually that weekend, I went home. I got home from work. I booked the weekend off, and I opened Visual Studio Code, and I went File, New Project, and I just started typing code for the very first startup I ever started working on, which was actually just a soccer app, my very first incarnation of a soccer app. And that's really what kind of got me all into startups in the first place.
So I got a million questions just following off that. First of all, I can kind of relate with the sales thing because one of my previous internships back when I was still in college was an industry sales position. And we were cold calling. We were working for a startup, and we were cold calling the crap out of all the leads that we had, generating new leads, going on Salesforce all 24/7, trying to track stuff. So I can kind of relate with the stress that's involved. You have quotas. You have you got to be the extrovert, but you also got to let the clients and the leads really talk their stuff out, right? Like the general industry sales advice that you get. First of all, pretty interesting. But before I go deeper into that, I wanted to quickly check. You have an engineering background, a bachelor's?
So I did a 2-year program at BCIT. It's computer systems technology with digital signal processing was a specialty I did. It's like a really intense, more practical crash course to computer science. Some pretty successful people have come out of that program, like the Marcus Fiend, I think the founder of Plenty of Fish, some other people. But it's pretty much like a really intense boot camp for 2 years, maybe slightly less on some of the theoretical, a bit more on the hands-on, like cracking the whip, 2-3 assignments due a night. So
that's awesome. It's like efficient, one of those like very efficient programs that teaches you what you really need to know for that industry experience. And kind of just to your point, there's kind of 2 things so my dad, he's also an entrepreneur, right? And he's kind of always taught me that there's 2 types of people in this world, in the business world. Those who can build and those who can sell, and those are the only ones who can truly be entrepreneurs. You're touching both areas here. So you're the 1% that seems like you can both build and sell. Now, obviously, there's a lot of nuance to what I'm saying here, but I think, that type of skill set allows you to be able to be hireable from the employee side of things, but also you're able to both build, but you're also able to tailor that, whatever you're building to selling or communication wise. You're able to sell to the right audience, all that sort of stuff. So that's pretty cool. Kind of onto that topic. I know I kind of went on a little small of a rant there, but when you were doing your sales job, right? I think the first thing I was a little bit curious about is, how long did you really stay in that sales job? Did you enjoy it? Did you dislike it? I feel like I got that answer from you because you're telling your whole story about getting into entrepreneurship, but just kind of what your thoughts on about sales and that starting point, because I know a lot of salespeople at my team. I also have worked with a lot of sales, and I've even done a little bit of sales myself. So it's a very interesting topic because some days, some years, right, depending on the economy, you can make so much money on some other years, for example, 2009, when you got hired, I'm assuming it was a little bit difficult, right? So it really depends a lot of the stuff. So yeah, would love your thoughts.
Yeah, so interesting question there. I think in terms of the type of people, I found sales to be very interesting because it's all about, you have a goal, you want to sell them something. Customers have needs, and how do you connect the customer and their needs to what you're offering? It sounds simple, but it's extremely complicated.
Yeah.
What I really had to learn when it comes to sales is that you really have to undo kind of the engineering mindset of presenting a solution.
Oh, yeah.
You really just got to dwell on the pains, on what's going on in their lives, on their worldview, and just kind of listening. As soon as I remember having this breakthrough with a sales coach, and I'm on a bit of a tangent here, so apologies. But my sales coach had really, what he got through to me was that I need to stop basically trying to sell people something, like trying to tell them that we have a great product for them. And instead, I have to just listen to what they have to say, and wrap my head around it and understand the pain they're going through. And so often, like that was when suddenly, boom, my sales went up and off the charts. It was when I just started listening and talking less. So that's really stuck with me over the years. It's even odd, when I'm doing things such as attending a podcast like this, because I'm so used to being a listener and asking questions. So that's just how I've learned to kind of get through in life. But just going back to your question, sales, yeah, it's very interesting. I think some people just love it. People that are so extroverted that it's a natural fit for them. Some people, maybe like yourself, maybe like myself, maybe a bit more on the introverted side, even though we may have extroverted tendencies. And so that can be really tough because you're putting yourself out there over and over again and getting rejections over and over and over again. Some people, that is just like water off a duck's back. But like probably yourself, myself, it's hard, it's kind of hard to deal with that. So I guess part of what I think about that is you really just got to make sure you're in a role that suits you and what you're kind of good at. And some people, that is sales, and they just knock it out of the park, and it's just so natural for them. But I'm glad I did it. It helped me succeed with Shredio, with my first startup, because so much of it was really selling to customers. A huge portion of it, especially in the early stages, getting these big tech companies that everyone knows their name of in Canada, like 50, 100 people, and getting them to connect their systems to my system that I built with a couple contractors. And so you really got to be able to build their trust, and that ultimately does come down to sales. So it's really helped me big time in the startups.
Okay, so kind of tying a little bit of that sales experience to your first startup, I'd like to really understand, and I'm sure the listeners would probably like to learn about what your startup really, your first ever startup, right, was, what it really entailed, how the sales piece kind of fit into the picture, how the engineering piece from your BCIT experience also fit into the picture. So what was that journey like?
Yeah, great question. There's just so much to talk about here, so I'll try and be careful not to get carried away. But they definitely, both the engineering and the sales, that is basically what I did as a founder, especially in the first couple of years. So I would almost go through an iterative cycle of building something and then trying to sell it, and then building something and then trying to sell it, and just repeating. And as I was going through those iterations, they kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger as I was starting to get some traction and get some product market fit. So really, if I go back to like the first, you were asking about the earlier part. So if I go back to the first 2 or 3 years, it was just being as scrappy as possible, trying to build an MVP as fast as possible, and then hustle, and get in front of people, show them what I'm working on, seeing if they connect with it, and if there's signs that they may actually want to become a customer. And so that was, really interesting. And it's major context switching. I found it was actually quite tough sometimes because you go into your builder mindset. I kind of close all my blinds and dim the lights and kind of go into coding mode and just start building. And I don't really talk to people. And then when I have something that's ready to show, it's been like 3 months, and that was like my purpose in life was getting this MVP done. And so I've kind of lost track of some leads, some customers. But then you just hit it hard again. You start reaching out to people, building those connections, just doing what you got to do to get meetings. And then suddenly you find yourself not coding, not building at all, and you're kind of suddenly in hustling mindset where you're trying to talk to people and seeing what they think about your product, and just taking their feedback and then kind of basically going to the whiteboard and planning what you're going to do next to try and actually get someone to buy your product. So I found it was a very interesting 3 years of just, almost breakneck speeds, context switching, going back and forth between the two, which was really quite difficult, but just absolutely essential, which may be one of the things I would do different next time is really try and find the proper, co-founder from day one to take on half of the kind of pain. But again, at the same time, I really tried to find a co-founder early on, and there just wasn't a match. And so, going on your own, as painful as it is, that's better than going with the wrong co-founder.
Right.
So I don't regret that part of it. Yeah.
I wanted to ask just a little bit of a more nuanced question. Just when you were talking about through your entire journey, you mentioned it was a soccer app, and I know for a fact that there's kind of a little bit of passion-driven interest there when it comes to you deciding to build a certain product, right? My next question is really like, did passion play a role? Because I know from our previous conversations, you like playing soccer. You played a lot of it when you were younger, right? So did that play a role at all? And was there something happened with the water bottle? Did that play a role at all in terms of you deciding that this was kind of the not just the app but the direction of your product?
Yeah. So good question. So the first startup, Shredio, was all about R&D, tracking, reporting, automation. The second startup, Pocket FC, that was all about soccer, fantasy soccer app that had real-time match simulations. That was kind of the really interesting edge about it. The reason why I did Pocket FC, so I finished Shredio, that was the juggernaut. That was 6 years. I sold it, stepped out, had to take care of tying up a bunch of loose ends, which took much longer than I had thought.
Yeah.
But I got that all done and wrapped up. And then I found myself asking the question, okay, what now? I'm done, right? What's next? I think I lasted about a week or two of doing nothing. And then I started the next project, which was Pocket FC, which just came from this burning kind of desire. Like I had finished with my Shredio. I had a bit of free time, but I was still working on some passion projects. So I wanted to find a game that I could play to pass the time. And I'm like, okay, I want to find a soccer manager game that is not like Football Manager, because that takes 3-4 hour play sessions even on mobile. I want something for someone on the go, like a 5-minute play session Football Manager game.
Yeah.
So it was that need, that kind of curiosity, that need for a solution like that didn't exist. Then I just started working on it, and then next thing you know, it turned into about a year and a half long project. So it almost came from a place of passion and not necessarily having a product that suits that need, and that's where that itch came from to work on Pocket FC. Additionally, when I was doing Shredio, I always promised myself when I finish with Shredio, especially if it's a successful exit, I want to give myself a break and work on a startup that is more just fun, even though it may not be as practical and as much of a sure thing. So those are kind of the reasons going into Pocket FC.
Okay, so real quick, I'm very curious because Shredio and Pocket FC are completely different areas, not just in terms of like the form of the product, but even the type of content, the exploration of use cases. Feels like there's a lot of discovery work involved, a lot of failing fast, I would assume, and a lot of obviously finding product market fit, like you said. So what was like that dynamic like in terms of like moving from, you said business automation with Shredio to Pocket FC, which is a mobile soccer game. Very interesting to, startups. And most people, if you look at a lot of startups founders' journeys, right, they'll probably take a lot of their experiences from their first startup into that second startup with relative experience, perhaps even relative product market fit direction. Doesn't seem like the case with you. It seems like you just kind of delved into the next big thing that more seemed like a more kind of interest-driven thing, but also at the same time you wanted to make money, right?
Yeah, I think part of the motivation for Pocket FC as well was to take these learnings that I had gained as a founder of Shredio, of a B2B app, to take those learnings of really being that product, that person that was driving strategy, driving vision, like setting the future of the company, pushing people to go in that direction, taking those learnings, and then I wanted to apply it in kind of the gaming world. So that was a bit of a hypothesis I had, because typically with games, what you'll find is you get very different advice from startup advice around games. A lot of incubators won't even fund gaming startups because they're just so high risk. And with the high risk comes incredibly high return. So it's kind of like a bit of a hits-based business. But I walked in there and I thought, okay, what if I can, take similar style of development I did in Shredio, and what if I can rapidly build a prototype in Pocket FC and begin to iterate on it and kind of get customer feedback and treat it like a startup? So that was kind of the working hypothesis. That was what I was hoping to explore and to answer. I would say I got close to figuring it out. I was driving the unit economics up to where it was going to be a net positive thing, where the LTV was higher than the CAC. I was really working hard on that. got close, but the funding began to run out as I'm kind of bankrolling this whole thing with my proceeds from Shredio and my own, life savings. So I just chose to draw a bit of a line because I was trying to get to a place where I had, okay, now I have this game, which is kind of a bit of a prototype that has these positive economics. Now I have a case for raising funds or funding. Sorry. So that was kind of the working goal, the objective. And I think I maybe invalidated that a little bit, where I think with games, you really have to just deliver a polished product really from the get-go. Yeah. So I think that would be one of the major lessons learned from that whole endeavor.
And I don't want to deviate, obviously, our listeners and the agenda too much, but I just kind of wanted to self-insert in here. I did work on a few passion projects related to games as well. When I was a little bit interested in the PM role, I was also interested in the game producer role. So I realized, I needed a little bit of game design experience, a little bit of Unity and Unreal. I ended up getting an internship at Unity, which kind of helped me get a few, people I found on LinkedIn to work on a passion project on games. So this is just like a 3D maze runner built out of Unreal. Was the producer for that. My experience, honestly, was that I just needed way more experience than I had at the time, right? It's felt like the more richer your game design and your technical experience is, because it's a whole different world, the more better value you're going to be to the team. But anyways, kind of deviated away from that. But I know for a fact that you didn't just work on those two entrepreneurial journeys. You also worked at a game company, correct? Is there any information you can share about that?
Yeah, so I did 1 year at Eastside Games. I also did I think it was a 6-month internship at EA as a QA tester. That was my very first job in tech. So I have those two experiences. My time at Eastside Games, that actually was related to when I was working on that very first app I was talking about when I first got the bug for entrepreneurship. And I went file, new project on Visual Studio Code, started writing the code for a soccer game that was like it was actually what Pocket FC was supposed to be. But that was my very first startup. I think I was very kind of green. So I only got about halfway there, which was like an action soccer mobile game for iOS. And I had to kind of do a major kind of scope cut and just ship. And it actually did well. It actually did better than Pocket FC, which is kind of crazy. So I had finished that game, and that was me just following the passions and building an app that I thought was really interesting. And so I finished that. Didn't have any money. I'd used my funds to, build that app. I was living in Vancouver, which even back then with the rent, I had a different lifestyle back then, going out for dinner all the time with my friends. And so my basically burn rate was extremely high and didn't last very long. But still, I had something great to show for it, which was a product. It was built in Objective-C and that whole iOS Cocos 2D framework. And then I also did a match simulation engine in C++. And so that gave me some really good talking points. Suddenly I was getting interviews at game companies by just sending out a few resumes. And that's kind of how I got into games, because I had followed my passions, built a great project, and was able to, use it as a talking point, which that wasn't the goal, but that's kind of the way it just panned out. Which is, I'm kind of in a similar situation right now as I'm exploring for what's next. I'm finding that these passions I've pursued over the past years have led to a great story that I can show people and just leads to really great conversations. But yeah, so I got into games for about a year. I really enjoyed it. My initial career goal was actually to work into production and the games industry as well. So, and the reason why I took computer science, maybe I got shoddy advice at 17, but I was doing research on the web, which was so new then. Yeah. And it was saying, if you want to get into production, you want to get there through dev or through art. So I figured, let's do development. That's my path into production. I took that because I'm not much of an artist. Yep. And that's sort of how I got into the games industry.
Interesting. So I know there's a few more questions that are always popping up whenever you're kind of going into this tangent, because obviously, it's a pretty deep, rich experience that we want to dive into. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask the differences between working for a company itself, kind of going back to what you said about working in a business versus for a business, right? What was that like? What was that differentiator? Because obviously you were your own boss on those other two projects until you decided to kind of go in and work for a company. Was that experience a little bit was it shocking at all? How was that transition for you?
And just to clarify, are you talking about that very first games industry job I had 10 years ago when I built the app and got in there? I think I really just had a taste of entrepreneurship by that point in time, just a taste of it, which was kind of, I kind of want to say the honeymoon phase, the idealistic phase, where it was 4 or 5 months working on that app. I built it up. I had something to show for it. But it was still that kind of romantic phase where you kind of, I found myself driving in my car sometimes and I get really excited, I'm a founder, this is great. And then I ended up taking that job at Eastside Games. And for me, it was a relatively easy transition, I guess, because I hadn't fully transitioned to being that founder for like 6-7 years. So that first time it was super easy, just kind of fit right into the team. Now, I think it still wouldn't be a problem. Like if my journey leads to having another job one day, then I don't see that being an issue at all. But it is going to be a bit different because it's been 6 or 7 years now where, the honeymoon phase died off in like year 1 or 2 when you're doing startups. And now it's like, hey, you wake up every day, you realize you've left your job, you've left great income. And there was like 2.5 years where I didn't get a single paycheck, So it's not what it always seems to be. And so 2.5 years, and then you kind of just wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and you think like, what have I done? Like I threw away a job and here I am working out of my living room for like 2.5 years and I'm, struggling to get customers. People tell me I'm crazy. Like people like laugh at me, like people don't take me seriously. And so at that point, like the feel good aspect of it definitely is gone by that point. And it's like, hey, now, my money is actually kind of going into the red. I'm still working on this project I believe in. I can't get people to believe in the project. But I guess, that's where maybe some of that character gets built too, because I kind of had to, push through those people that I really valued and really respected, like CTOs and CEOs telling me that what I wanted to do with Shredio was impossible. You can't do it. You can't just generate documentation from sparse data. And that was like 20, 30-year veterans telling me that. And so that was really, I guess, an interesting kind of like, the formation, like the diamonds are formed in that kind of rough, right? That's where I really kind of pushed through, kind of kept going, even though I felt like I was crazy and I felt like I had made a big mistake and people were telling me I was crazy. And you just push through and eventually, they say if you want to make it in startups, just don't quit. And there's some truth to that. Like if you can just keep iterating on what you're doing and you have the runway and you can just keep iterating, like eventually there's a good chance you will figure it out one day. Maybe not always for sure. I mean, that's a bit of like just a quote. But yeah, no, that was kind of interesting. I think I'm kind of deviating from your question, but that was part of it, was like, now that I've been through that process, just kind of going back to your question of people telling me I can't do things, people telling me that I'm crazy, and then you kind of push through and then you kind of get to that area of value and you get to that area of kind of delivering on what you kind of set out to do. And it's like a great moment. It's like that's when things really start, like the fireworks start going and it's amazing. So that will be interesting as long as I can bring that with me. If I do go back into the working world, as long as I can kind of keep taking that initiative within reason, then I think I could do that. But maybe I just belong being an entrepreneur from now on. I don't know. It's tough to say.
So I'm very glad you deviated because I am going to kind of regurgitate some of the stuff that you've said, but in maybe a little slight different angle. I think there's this one book that I read called The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F by Mark Manson. And that book kind of taught me, and this kind of applies it a little bit, is, there's a lot of pain and suffering when it comes to trying to chase your passion, obviously, right? And even I would argue that it's not really about trying to chase an end goal passion, because that's kind of more so, you're idealistic about what the ideal end goal really is, but more so just enjoying the painful moments. You got to suffer through that because at the very end, you'll get the most fulfillment out of those most painful moments, right? So I could imagine like a lot of people like you probably get misty-eyed now thinking about it, going back and like, oh yeah, I went through some hard times. But then when you exited with Shredio and then when you made some income off that startup, you're realizing like I managed to get something done, right? Versus like all that opposition that you probably faced. Is that kind of something you felt?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's crazy. People would just kind of like laugh at you in the early stages. People don't take you seriously. You question yourself. You kind of go through a crisis. At least I did. 1 or 2 or 3 years in, even for sometimes I kind of joke. Sometimes I would tell people I quit the startup and I'd take a month off and then I'd kind of get some perspective and then come back and hit it harder again. Like every time I walked away for a couple of weeks to kind of I'm like, I quit, I leave, I can't do this. And you kind of step away for 3 weeks and then that thought just starts creeping back into your head. Like, it can be done though. Like in theory, the hypothesis is if I do this and this, then this will happen. And, I still kind of believe the hypothesis. And then you kind of get dragged back into it over and over again because I wasn't ready to fully walk away. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's the difference between stepping away and walking away, right? So sorry, what was the original question? I keep deviating. What was the initial
Oh
thing you
no,
were
my
asking?
question was more so like, do you feel like that moment of fulfillment due to all that passion, like painfulness that you kind of suffered through, was rewarding enough for you to just look back and realize like this was absolutely, rewarding for me, like no regrets whatsoever of what you've done.
I think so. Yeah, it's very rewarding. It's a great feeling. Like you get justified. You feel like everything you've done is great. You can't help but wonder sometimes where things would have gone if you just stayed in the working world. For myself, anyways, because I mean, I see people around me. There was people that I hired into Shredio, and they were getting like crazy salaries. Like I was the founder, I was getting like peanuts, right? Like, and then we hire these people, and they're getting like multiple six figures for doing some pretty key roles, and it's kind of like just watching like the bank account kind of drain quickly while we're paying them every 2 weeks. So it's a very interesting thing. And then they get like equity and all these things. And so I think financially, some of them probably have done better than I did even as the founder, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, right? So I think it's the people that really get like the huge successful exits. I think it's like kind of like this bell curve, right? Where you get really maybe a tiny amount on the end. There's a couple kind of, medium ones. And then there's a bunch. There's like probably 80, 90 percentile that's kind of like near zero. So I would say it's pretty rewarding. And I think I still would do it all over again. I wouldn't just stay in working in tech because I didn't feel the passion. I didn't feel that kind of drive. And then when I was thinking about doing startups, there's that inner excitement. So I guess if I fast forward to my deathbed, like even the finances part of it, I don't even care about that. Like the very fact that I chased a dream and kind of brought it to reality, that's going to be, that is hugely fulfilling for me. And I think that's going to be something I look back on in 20, 30 years as being like a key moment. Like regardless of how much I made or how much I could have made if I stayed in like a, big tech job.
Yeah.
The very fact of just making people telling you can't do something and you believe in it and then you make it happen and people believe you and everyone's like, great, okay, you did it. That's awesome. That's hugely fulfilling, and that's actually still sinking in. I think it's a little bit in the background right now, but it's definitely starting to sink in a little bit.
Right. Okay, no, that's awesome. We have about like 5 to 10 minutes left for the podcast, so I do kind of want to go to my next question here. This question is more so, and this is probably my second or third last question here for you, is for those who are interested, and this is obviously, I'm sure you'll probably go on another rant about this because I'm sure you have your own, objective and subjective opinions about this. Is for those who are interested in entrepreneurship, for especially in today's world, I feel like I'm getting a lot of people that I know, acquaintances and friends within my circles who are interested in startups, going into the startup world within tech because obviously, as I kind of mentioned before, the VC capital these days is circling around like crazy. Likewise, the fact that there's not as much hiring as opposed to, like, for example, 2021 when every tech company was hiring a lot of people. So they're kind of choosing that startup as an alternative path. But they're always kind of on the fence, as if you kind of know what I mean, right? Like, because it's a very risky move. It's something where you really need that push you need that drive, and you need that product market fit, or that idea or that drive to be able to achieve product market fit by iterating, failing fast, all that sort of stuff that you would probably see from Eric Ries's book, the lean startup and all that sort of stuff. So, would love your thoughts on how people today could probably in the digital age, right, try to really go into that startup world and what skills. And foundational, I guess, like both foundational skill sets and obviously sales that they really need.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so a couple things come to mind. One is startups are all about timing. If you look at what's happening in the world today, and I guess in the last like 20 years, there's been different trends that just take off and the world changes. So we're living through one right now, AI, LLMs, like there's so much opportunity, so much room for like creating something of value, a startup, and riding that and scaling it and delivering something of value to the world. So like it's a time thing. Like if you look back in like the, like 50s, 60s when there wasn't really tech and there's just like factories everywhere and you can only start so many businesses and they're mostly service firms like accounting shops or a lawyer firm, things like that. There's no like rapidly emerging technology that you can kind of ride the wave of. So I think it's healthy that there's a lot of people that want to do it. It's definitely a timing thing. It may not be like this forever. There may come a point where all the startups are kind of done and the AI, technological advancement kind of begins to maybe slow down or hit a bit of a wall. I don't know if that'll actually happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, how often does something like AI LLMs come around? Like not very common, like this type of change. So from a timing perspective, like now is the time, I think, in the next year and a half, maybe even 2 years, but I think it's going to be too late within a couple of years. All the kind of niches will be taken and executed on well enough and kind of captured. I mean, there'll still be always opportunities, but like the ripe opportunities now are huge. So from a timing perspective, like I think it's great. When it actually comes to doing it, it's a big decision because you leave that security, you leave that paycheck, especially if you have kids, if you have a mortgage, if you have dependents, that can really, reduce and limit the runway you have before you get to funding. So that's things that you have to take into consideration. Maybe it means that you just need to raise some, seed and angel funding right away and just give up some of the company so that you can make that possible. I was talking to someone yesterday, actually, that's starting a new business, and they said they walked away from a $150,000 investment.
Wow.
For 10% of the company. And, I can understand the reasons they had when they explained it to me, which is like, that's a lot, like YC will take 7% for a similar amount of money, but it's US. So I can understand why that person made that decision. Maybe they have a bit of a runway. But at the end of the day, it's, one thing I would really suggest is don't get too greedy. You know what I mean? Because there's going to be the startups are going to be way harder than you imagine, way harder than you predict. And so if you give up some more of the company ahead of time and you kind of just eliminate some of that risk, of that runway risk, because there's going to be surprise things. There's going to be surprise lawsuits. There's going to be surprise things always happening. And so it's always going to be more expensive than you kind of budget it to be. So I would say and just for the sake of your quality of life, if you are going to be having trouble going to sleep for the next 3 months because you have 3 months of runway, and it's like you need more than 3 months to get to product market fit, typically. Right. So I would say, just be a bit just be good to yourself, take some funding, even if you got to give up from the company, make sure it's someone that you can work with, because that's a huge part of it. You don't want a bad investor from day one. But yeah, I mean, timing is now, just consider how you want to do it in a way that's not going to drive yourself into the ground. Sometimes, one other thing I'll say really quick is it doesn't always have to be that kind of disruptive, quit your job and start working full time. There is that moonlighting thing. Of course, things are going to go incredibly slow, but sometimes if you can just come up with a very simple MVP and kind of a little bit hustle and get that built and kind of validate it with an extremely small market and it starts kind of growing, then, but that might be easier said than done because when you're working full time and jobs today are so demanding, so will your performance at your job start to drop and your reputation begins to drop? So those are things you want to keep in mind a little bit.
So I'm kind of hearing 3 aspects, right? One is obviously timing, which I absolutely agree with. That is absolutely key. You can be the most successful entrepreneur with the best execution strategy in the world, but with the wrong timing, it just doesn't matter. It's kind of down the trash chute. The second one I'm hearing obviously is don't be selfish, which I also agree, right? Because I think you have to set yourself up for success. And the third one I think I kind of heard from you as well is more so take the funding if you can. Also kind of make sure that you're working with the right people and you're doing the right stuff that puts you in the right spot. Because it seems like I agree that the AI and LLM stuff is now. And I do agree that who knows what's going to happen. It was Bitcoin, it was crypto 2 years ago. Now it's AI. Who knows what's going to be 5 years from now. So you should definitely make sure that timing is perfect there. So last question before we end the podcast is more so just about you is what are your plans so far? Because I know right now you're kind of in a pivot because you've gone through 2 brilliant entrepreneurial journeys with 2 varying results. Wanting to understand what your plans are for the future as an entrepreneur, as an extra entrepreneur, what you think you're going to go into in the future and where you at least see your journey lying.
I love that question. That's great. So you're very much right. I'm in a time of transition right now, which is, ups and downs as well with the transition, kind of trying to refigure things out, kind of get things in perspective. And it's always tough too when you kind of lose your purpose, because that's a big thing with startups. It's kind of a big part of your life purpose. So when that gets snatched away, it can be a bit heavy on your psyche to kind of deal with that every day. You don't have something that you're building. That can be really, tough, especially for a builder, kind of like myself. And I think kind of like yourself and other people. So I think what's next? I am kicking the tires of the working world. I've had a couple, pretty key interviews, but I'm finding the job market to be extremely competitive, and I feel like I kind of have a lot of interesting skills to offer. And I'm talking to people in the product management world. I'm doing a lot of informational interviews, and I'm talking to a lot of execs, and they're saying, okay, so when we post an intermediate role, we get like 600-700 applications in like 3 days. And higher roles, there's all these layoffs, so it's extremely competitive. So I'm kind of seeing that, and I'm still managing to get a couple key interviews, which is great. But this is actually sort of, I feel a tug back into the entrepreneurship world, into startups, because I post a little profile online that I may be looking for a co-founder. I'm getting get a bunch of hits, and these are very impressive people that are reaching out to me. And then, some things like this. And I just feel like there's a bit of a more natural pull towards startups for me in terms of where the kind of opportunity is. So I'm starting to kind of eye that again, even though I was thinking I might be ready for a paycheck for a couple of years after going through, 6-7 years of startups, and 6 of those years, or I guess 4 of those years, were bootstrapped before I got funding.
Yeah.
So, but I think now, since I am starting to, kick the tires of the working world, they say the best way to start a startup is you kind of solve a problem that you're facing in your own life. So, of course, I guess I take that to heart. So as I'm looking through doing this job search, I'm finding it so frustrating. And I found that I came up with a bit of a unique process for putting together completely custom applications using a new approach, which is, using things like LLMs and stitching things together and kind of cataloging your experience. So now I find myself working on basically I'm giving myself 2 to 3 weeks to work on this little passion project of whipping this tool together, which is like a custom tailored application generation tool. And let me just say, it doesn't just use AI, but it takes your experience and just polishes it up in a nice way using LLMs. So now I find myself working on this, and this very well could lead to the next startup, right? Because it's a tool that I'm building to just supercharge my own job search as I'm kind of kicking the tires of the working world. And I could easily see this turning into a tool that other people might benefit from too. And so I'm actually, as I'm building this, I'm planning to reach out to people. I'm making it a responsive web app. I'm going to give it a URL and everything. And I'm going to start meeting people for coffee and saying, hey, if you want to supercharge your job search, here's a little tool I built. Wow. So, who knows where that's going to lead? But I guess I don't exactly know what's next, but, I have a suspicion that might be part of it. Maybe it'll be back in the working world.
Yeah.
But I think one of those two things
I think one of the more constant variables that will continue staying is that passion, at least the entrepreneurial drive that will lead you to build passion projects and stuff on the side. Just testing use cases out, kind of, because you have the skills to be able to implement the ideas, not just be able to ideate, but also be able to implement these ideas, which might be very fun for you sometimes because you're really able to kind of dive into it while you're going through this transition, right?
Yeah, and just to add in really quick, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, because I look back at Shredio, and that started because I was doing this technical project management, and I saw companies struggling with R&D tracking and reporting. I just saw them suffering and just begging for a solution. And so I kind of asked myself the question, well, what if we could tie into Jira and kind of automate some of the stuff by using some AI, some predictive modeling? And so it was all that came from that question, what if? And that kind of 2-week project turned into a 2-month thing, and then turned into a year, and then turned into 5 years, and then 6 years. And similar with Pocket FC, it was started with an experiment. What if there's a match sim component in the web app? And kind of similar now, this itch, which is why not use something like LLMs to supercharge this search by taking my information and kind of splicing it together? Yeah. So I think a lot of it does come from that curiosity, that kind of tinkering mindset, where you give yourself the space and the freedom to ask yourself, the what if questions. Right. And then you actually kind of explore it and begin to build it out. But I think one of the big learnings over the years for me has been to really don't let that scope get carried away, because it's so easy to be well, it would be so much better. It would be 20% better if we added this, and then 30% better if we added this. Because at the end of the day, literally everything you're doing is a hypothesis. Yeah. And so you kind of just want to validate as soon as possible, right? And so that is maybe some of the learnings I'm keeping, which is just keep the MVPs very small, very focused, a very kind of narrow segment of early adopters, because you can just generalize as time goes on. But if you can solve the problem for those early adopters, then a really narrow segment of them in a way that doesn't take too long, I think that's kind of the trick.
I think I'm hearing two things is first of all, don't lose that urge to dabble, especially if you have the skills to really do so and you have this ideation kind of vouch for yourself. Really kind of take those skills into your advantage and dabble around, right? And kind of the second thing, like you said, is working with the different tools, making sure you're using the latest technologies, but really also kind of making sure the use case, you're focusing on the use case, not let scope creep, I guess like the tech world likes to call it, the product world likes to call it scope creep is, don't let that take over because it's more so like taking one very narrow use case, but then doing it absolutely really well, right? Which I feel like is kind of like always that educational piece that I'm told a lot as I kind of explore my own kind of entrepreneurial ideas. So with that being said, we dived through a lot of stuff. I know we kind of went on a tangent across multiple different topics, but I think we got a lot of content today out of this episode. So again, I absolutely appreciate the time you took today to go over your entire entrepreneurial journey. It was really rich and it was really fascinating. And until next time, thank you all for all the listeners of the PM Hive Podcast, and we will see you again soon. Goodbye.